Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another thrilling episode of Tim and Tom's Film Nights. I'm Thomas, and I'm joined by my trusty sparring partner, Timothy. Today, we're delving into the world of supernatural action comedy with R.I.P.D, or Rest in Peace Department, as it's officially known. Now, Timothy, what did you make of this film?
Well, Tom, I found it to be quite passable, but I'm afraid that doesn't exactly set the world on fire, does it? It had its moments, but overall, I wouldn't rush to watch it again anytime soon.
Oh, really? Well, as a self-proclaimed action fan, I was expecting so much more from this film. What exactly did you find lacking in terms of plot or character development?
Well, Thomas, I found the premise itself rather intriguing. The idea of dead police officers being recruited by the afterlife to track down and punish other spirits who've escaped judgment. Well, that's a pretty novel concept. Wouldn't you agree?
However, the execution was where it fell short for me.
I mean, don't get me wrong. The visual effects were quite impressive, but the humor often felt forced and sometimes even borderline cringe-worthy. And the chemistry between Bridges and Reynolds, while not completely absent, certainly could have been much more developed. As for the plot itself, it felt like a mishmash of other better films. You've got elements of Ghostbusters, Men in Black, and even a dash of The Matrix thrown in for good measure. But it didn't quite manage to carve out its own unique identity, did it? And don't get me started on the villain's plan. Yeah? It was so predictable from miles away. I mean, come on. Who didn't see that twist coming? It just felt like a cheap attempt to create some artificial stakes in an otherwise mediocre film. But hey, I'm not saying it was completely devoid of entertainment value, right, Thomas?
Well, Timothy, I'll give you that the special effects were decent enough, and there were some moments of levity sprinkled throughout the film. However, I found myself bored more often than not, and I agree with you about the predictability of the villain's plan. It was as cliche as a haunted house on Halloween night. And don't get me started on that forced romance between Bridges and Reynolds' characters. It felt so forced and unnecessary, especially since there were no real sparks between them. I mean, they barely shared any decent scenes together, let alone any chemistry. As for the plot itself, it was just a mishmash of better movies, as you said. It didn't even try to bring anything new or original to the table. It was like watching an amateur chef attempt a gourmet meal using leftover ingredients from other people's recipe. And, don't get me started on the ending.
I mean, seriously.
They just wrap everything up in a neat little bow and everyone rides off into the sunset? I was expecting some sort of twist or cliffhanger, but nope, it was just over. So in conclusion, Timothy, would you say R.I.P.D is worth watching?
Well, Thomas, I have to admit that it did hold my attention for a while, but ultimately I found myself wishing that they put more effort into the writing and character development. Now, speaking of which, you mentioned earlier that you were expecting some sort of twist or cliffhanger at the end, but did you know that in the comic book it's based on there actually is a sequel? The story picks up right where R.I.P.D leaves off and follows our heroes as they continue their adventures battling rogue spirits. Unfortunately, the filmmakers decided not to pursue this follow-up for reasons unknown to me. Perhaps they thought it would be too much of a financial risk given the mixed reviews R.I.P.D received. Who knows? Anyway, what do you make of that tidbit?
Oh, really? Well, I must admit, I hadn't heard about a sequel. That would have been quite interesting to see. But as you said, it seems like the filmmakers had other plans in mind. Now, speaking of which, did you know that one of the original cast members was actually replaced during filming? It's true. Kevin Bacon, who plays the villain, was initially set to star alongside Bridges and Reynolds. But, due to scheduling conflicts, he had to drop out and was replaced by Stéphanie Szostak. I must say, she did a decent job considering the circumstances, But I can't help but wonder how different the film would have turned out if Bacon had stayed on board. What do you think, Tim?
Well, Thomas, I must admit that I didn't know about the cast change. And while I enjoyed Szostak's performance, I can't help but agree with you that Kevin Bacon would have been a perfect fit for the villain role. His charisma and screen presence are truly unmatched. But alas, we can only imagine what could have been. So in conclusion, while R.I.P.D had its moments, it ultimately failed to live up to my expectations as both a supernatural action comedy and an adaptation of the comic book series. Do you disagree, Thomas?
Well, Timothy, I must admit that I haven't read the comic book series it's based on, but I have heard from several fans that they felt let down by how different the film version was compared to the source material. Apparently, there were quite a few changes made in adapting the story for the big screen, some of which pleased die-hard fans, while others left them feeling disappointed. From what I gather, the filmmakers chose to focus more on the comedic aspect of the story, whereas the original comic books emphasized the action and supernatural elements more. They also changed some major plot points and characters' motivations, which didn't sit well with purists who believed that these alterations detracted from what made the series so special in the first place. But hey, we can't expect an exact replica of a comic book on the silver screen, right? So Timothy, what do you think of the changes that were made for R.I.P.D? Did they enhance or hinder your enjoyment of the film?
Well, Tom, as someone who hasn't read the comic book series either, I can only comment on what I saw in the film version itself. And while I agree that it leaned more towards the comedy side than the action supernatural aspect, I personally found this balance to be effective in its own way. It made for a lighthearted watch and prevented things from getting too dark or heavy-handed. As for the changes made to the characters and plot points, while some did throw me off at first, I eventually came around to accept them as part of the film's unique interpretation of the story. In fact, I think certain alterations actually worked in its favor, such as fleshing out the relationship between Bridges and Reynolds' characters more fully than what was presented in the comics. So, all things considered, while I can understand why die-hard fans might be disappointed by how different R.I.P.D is from its source material, I personally found that the changes made for the film version worked well, enough to entertain me throughout its runtime. What do you think, Thomas?
So, Timothy, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the cast of R.I.P.D. I thought they did a decent job given the mediocre material they had to work with. First off, we have Jeff Bridges as the gruff, world-weary cop turned reluctant spirit detective Roy. Now, while he certainly brought his signature laid-back charm to the role, I couldn't help but feel that he was just kind of going through the motions at times. He didn't really elevate the character or the story in any significant way, which is a shame considering his talent as an actor. As for his partner in crime fighting, the young and eager rookie cop turned ghostly companion, played by Reynolds, I found him to be slightly more entertaining than Bridges. Don't get me wrong. He wasn't Oscar-winning material here either, but at least he tried to inject some much-needed energy into their tired old buddy cop dynamic. Their chemistry wasn't completely off the charts, but it was passable enough to keep me moderately engaged. However, let's not forget about the supporting cast. Kevin Bacon, who sadly had to drop out due to scheduling conflicts, was replaced by Stéphanie Szostak as the femme fatale-esque villain. And while she did an acceptable job given her limited screen time, she failed to capture the same level of charisma and charm that Bacon would have brought to the role. Other notable mentions include Mary-Louise Parker as the quirky, tech-savvy, ghostly operative, and Marisa Miller as the sexy yet ultimately forgettable ghost-tastic waitress. Overall, while the cast wasn't exactly Oscar-worthy, they did their best with what they were given. What do you think, Timothy?
Well, Thomas, I think it's important to remember that films like R.I.P.D. are primarily made for entertainment purposes, and while they may not necessarily leave a lasting impact on our culture or society at large, they do serve as an escape from reality for many people. As far as cultural impact goes, I would say that R.I.P.D. has had some influence on the supernatural action comedy genre. While it didn't exactly reinvent the wheel in terms of storytelling or character development, it did pave the way for future films and TV shows that blend humor with supernatural elements. For example, shows like Supernatural and movies like Ghostbusters answer the call can be seen as spiritual successors to R.I.P.D., albeit with more nuanced writing and stronger female leads. But let's not forget about the cultural impact of the comic book series it was based on. Peter M. Lenkov, who created the original R.I.P.D. Comics, has a long-standing legacy in the comic book industry, known for his work on titles like Maverick and the Punisher. His unique blend of EM humor and action-packed storytelling has inspired countless artists and writers to explore new genres within the comic book medium. So while R.I.P.D. itself might not be remembered as a cinematic masterpiece, it did contribute somewhat to popularizing the supernatural action comedy genre and honoring the legacy of its source material. What do you think, Thomas?
Well, Timothy, I must admit that you have a point there. While R.I.P.D. might not have left a lasting cultural impact like some other classic films or TV shows, it did serve as an entertaining diversion for many people who just wanted to laugh and forget about their troubles for a little while. And as you said, it paved the way for future supernatural action comedies that have tried to replicate its formula, albeit with varying degrees of success. However, I do think it's important to acknowledge the potential drawbacks of films like R.I.P.D. As consumers, we should be more discerning about what kinds of stories we support and promote through our box office dollars. While mindless escapism can be healthy in moderation, we don't want to rely solely on Hollywood tropes and cliches for our entertainment. It's crucial that we also support independent films, documentaries, and other forms of art that tackle more challenging topics and push the boundaries of storytelling. Otherwise, we risk stagnating both artistically and intellectually as a society. But hey, that's just my humble opinion. What do you think, Timothy?
Well, Thomas, I think we've thoroughly discussed our opinions on R.I.P.D., both the good and the not so good. As for my final thoughts, I stand by my rating of 6 out of 10 stars. While it wasn't a masterpiece, it did manage to entertain me throughout its runtime. It had its moments of humor and action that kept me engaged thanks to the chemistry between Bridges and Reynolds. However, as an avid fan of supernatural thrillers, I was slightly disappointed by how lighthearted and comedic the film turned out to be. But hey, we can't expect every adaptation to perfectly capture the essence of its source material, right? Now, it's time for our usual plea to our viewers. Please leave your thoughts in the comments section below, whether you agree or disagree with our opinions. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed this video, and hit that little bell icon to be notified when we upload new content. We love hearing from our audience, so don't hesitate to join in on the conversation. Until next time, cheers and happy viewing.